Why is it so challenging to go back to the moon if we've already been there once? In 1972, a person last walked on the moon. Although technology has advanced greatly since then and an increasing number of nations have built their space program, humans have yet to return to the moon. What causes this? Let's investigate. The primary driver, we must look back to the final decade of the 1960s to discover the factors that motivated the mission to the moon. The space race was a tenacious contest between the two superpowers that took place after World War II throughout the Cold War, with the ultimate aim of landing a citizen of the nation on the moon. The United States would win this conflict, in which both countries aimed to show that they were more advanced than their rivals militarily and technologically. More than just a means to an end, the mission to the moon was a chance to demonstrate to the world who would set the pace for world politics for the rest of the century. More political than scientific motivations drove humankind's mission to the moon. Would we have gotten to the moon in 1969 if history had been different, just out of pure scientific worry? Everything seems to point to the contrary. As we previously stated, the stress brought on by the political circumstances was what inspired the Americans to send a mission to our satellite with human crew members. Without this rivalry with the USSR, it would have been difficult to envisage the American government mobilizing the almost 400,000 individuals who took part in the Apollo program and dedicated themselves to it over the course of its 14-year lifespan, which is roughly comparable to today's $120,000 million. Today, it is inconceivable that the American government would once more provide funding for a journey of this kind at such a high expense to the country. The exorbitant cost of once more landing on the moon, it was difficult to reach the moon because, in addition to the technological difficulties we shall explore later, there were also several economic difficulties. A statute that President Donald Trump signed in March 2017 grants NASA an annual budget of roughly $19.5 billion, which is already close to $20 billion. Although this sum appears to be enormous, it is actually quite modest when divided among all of the agency's departments and ambitious initiatives, including the James Webb Space Telescope, the Space Launch System, and distant missions to the Sun, Jupiter, Mars, the asteroid belt, the Kuiper Belt, and the edge of the solar system. In addition, compared to earlier years, NASA's budget is slightly low. The amount of money allocated to the American space program has grown dramatically since 1960, breaking the previous high of 5.3% of the national budget in 1965. But 5 years later, in the early 1970s, when the Americans had won the space race, NASA's funding was significantly reduced for a number of reasons, including the decline in public interest in the moon and the Apollo 13 mission's mishap. Due to these circumstances, the missions Apollo 18, 19, and 20 would be canceled, leaving Apollo 17 as the final mission to the moon with human crew. As a result, NASA's budget has been below 1% for the past 40 years and has been approaching 0.4% of the federal budget over the past 15 years. In other words, if we haven't visited the moon by now, it's because governments don't care and because there aren't enough financial resources. Where did technology go? The Atlas V, which was used to launch astronauts to the moon, will be replaced by NASA's new SLS, Space Launch System, rocket. This rocket made its debut with the launch of the Artemis I mission, which was successful in putting the Orion capsule into lunar orbit. This new spacecraft will carry astronauts to the lunar surface. Many people were interested to learn that the Artemis I mission was twice postponed before launch due to problems with the rocket's fuel chambers, necessitating the need for more testing before the spacecraft could be launched. But why was the SLS launch so challenging? NASA ought to have years of experience by now, right? The truth is that the Apollo missions were not easy to launch either. As you may recall, the first mission to successfully land was number 11, meaning that the previous 10 missions failed for a variety of reasons, with the majority of them experiencing multiple cancellations due to weather or technical issues. Some Apollo missions never even took off, yet this is almost ever mentioned. It is also important to keep in mind that despite having expertise with the Apollo spacecraft, NASA still had significant difficulties putting the space shuttles into orbit. Since the fueling systems for the shuttle were different from those of the Apollo spacecraft and Saturn V rocket, they frequently caused issues during launch. The shuttles were incredibly intricate machines with engines that burned both solid and liquid fuel, combining the thrust of a rocket with the aerodynamics of an airplane. All launch attempts suffered technical difficulties as a result of this complexity. In reality, shuttle launches suffered the most cancellations, with some being postponed up to 5 times before taking off safely, according to the registration of launch cancellations. The issue with fuel supply: the Artemis 1 mission was twice postponed before it was able to launch because of fuel system technical issues. These issues also contributed to the cancellation of the Apollo missions and were experienced by the shuttles. For more than 50 years, fuel leaks have been the most frequent type of rocket failure and a major cause of launch cancellations. Why is this issue still present today? The rocket's hydrogen fuel is to blame for the problem. The simplest and lightest element, hydrogen, is abundant on Earth but is combined with other elements. Therefore, to acquire pure hydrogen, molecular separation techniques like electrolysis must be utilized. Since hydrogen is such a light element, it takes billions of hydrogen atoms to make just 1 gram of material. In a typical atmosphere and at regular temperatures, hydrogen can squeeze through any aperture, no matter how small. Nevertheless, leaks are far more likely in a cold environment and at high pressures. Space rockets function best in conditions like these. The fuel tanks of a rocket must be permanently connected through cables and hoses to terrestrial cooling systems prior to launch in order to maintain their full fuel capacity. Some connections come apart from the bridge during takeoff, since these connections can't be tightened snugly, and it's challenging to prevent leaks when they're at high pressures and low temperatures. This is the location where leaks typically happen. In other words, hydrogen is a fuel that makes it challenging for rockets to launch. But why not use another fuel if this is the issue? Rocket reuse. The tremendous efficiency of hydrogen fuel, which has the advantage of offering more thrust while weighing less, is the reason NASA continues to employ it. The law, not the physical kind, but rather political ones, is nevertheless a significant factor. As part of the SLS rocket program, the U.S. Congress mandated in 2010 that NASA must continue using the shuttle-era rockets. In fact, although you may not be aware of it, the SLS engines were the same ones that were employed by the space shuttles at the time. Congress proposed that NASA employ the contracts, investments, budget, personnel, industrial base, and existing infrastructure in the U.S. that were used for the space shuttle in the new SLS program in order to maximize resources as the budget was cut. The Orion 1 would also be reused, as with the current propulsion systems, including the external storage tank, the solid fuel engines, and the liquid fuel engines that have so many leaks. This was everything recycled and prepared for the new Artemis 1 project. To put it another way, the Artemis Project, which aims to send fresh astronauts to the moon, employs the same machinery, including rockets, engines, launch pads, and technology as the space shuttles did more than a decade ago. That is why returning to the moon is so challenging. Aside from touch displays, Artemis 1's technology isn't much that different from what we had 50 years ago. Furthermore, the most compelling reason we haven't visited the moon yet is also the most straightforward. There hasn't been a necessity to do so. In addition to the innumerable experiments conducted on the moon, the Apollo missions produced so many samples of lunar material that many of them are still unstudied by scientists today. We must also add that NASA will be concentrating on projects like sending satellites and probes to many other parts of the solar system in addition to Skylab, the laboratory in Earth orbit, in the upcoming years. Perhaps the most pertinent issue is, why should we go back to the moon when there is still so much to discover about the other planets? There is nothing wrong with NASA in view of current scientific advancements. Robots are now used to explore Mars, new solar systems are discovered almost every day, and phenomena like gravitational waves that were previously only theorized are now being observed. As we've shown, there are a number of causes for why we haven't visited the moon since 1972, but none of them is related to, say, the bizarre conspiracy ideas that have been going about on social media for years. We may return, even though we haven't in the past. The NASA Artemis Project, which aspires to land a man on the moon once more, will be seen on the horizon of the following human-crewed journey to our satellite. It's also possible that a woman is taking a fresh stride on our natural satellite on this occasion, copying Neil Armstrong in 1969.